It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to Almeida Greeks. It's the last panel in what has been a really, I think, wonderful festival here at the theatre of all things Greek. There's one final event after this left in the festival, which is on the November the 12th, which is a complete reading of the Odyssey in locations around London, which is, I think, going to be very exciting. My name's Charlotte Higgins. I'm the chief cultural writer at The Guardian and a classicist. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our panellists tonight. On my immediate right, Giles Fraser, who's a priest in South London, a columnist on The Guardian, a fellow leader writer on The Guardian, and a philosopher. And next to him, Edith Hall, Professor Edith Hall, who is one of the foremost experts on Greek tragedy. She's professor at King's College, London, author of a great book on Greek tragedy called Greek Tragedy, and her latest excellent book is called Introducing the Ancient Greeks. And on the very end, the wonderful Fiona Shaw, who needs little introduction, a great actor, latterly also a great director. She is renowned. One of the reasons we've wanted her very much to be here is that she has inhabited two great Greek roles, Sophocles' Electra and Euripides' Medea, but also has latterly directed tragic operatic roles, which I hope we might get to talk about as well. But the title of this session is, I think, from Aristotle's The EastEnders. I'm not sure how deeply we'll get into EastEnders, but we'll definitely start with Aristotle. Aristotle's Poetics contains within it a much argued over definition or description of tragedy, which I will read. Tragedy, then, is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. In language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative. Through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. Edith. How far does that get us in understanding tragedy, Greek tragedy?
Well, it gets us an awful lot further than anyone had ever got before, that's for sure, and people are very stuck on it still. He's actually answering Plato. Plato, who was his teacher at the academy, where he spent 20 years, had banned all tragedy from the ideal republic on the ground that it was extremely bad for you, made you effeminate, made you imitate people doing bad things like sleeping with their mothers and, you know, sort of generally being immoral and committing adultery and all the other things that we love to watch in tragedy. But Socrates in Plato's Republic had thrown down a gauntlet, which was if somebody out there can write a prose treatise saying why this sensationalist genre can be both useful to the community and pleasurable, please do so. Then I will let it into the Republic. So Aristotle's taking his notes, he's 19 and he's a real geek, and he goes off and about 30 years later produces the answer, which is, it is all the things that he says it is, it's of a certain magnitude, it's a serious action, it's an imitation, and that it brings about whatever this word catharsis, that your dreadful translation as purgation, comes out as, okay? But we actually all know, on a gut level, exactly what that means. We all know how, if we've been to see a serious piece of art of any kind that affects us to emotions like feeling terribly sorry for someone or feeling very scared about the world, that we may well end up in floods of tears, and we will probably feel a bit better afterwards. Right? We know that, right? Everybody knows that. The last time I really, really wept at the end of something was 12 Years a Slave. I just did, and in a way I felt edified and better for it, right? That's what he's talking about. The trouble is this word catharsis, because it's got 6 different meanings in ancient Greek. In fact, one of the metaphors is nothing to do with purgation. It does actually mean Senecort. Okay, it actually can mean taking your laxatives. All right? It can. That's exactly what catharsis can mean. It just means clearing out. But it can also mean, very interestingly, words like complicated grafting, botanically, of training a bit of a tree in a particular direction. training it up. And there are about 5 other metaphors that it also belongs to. That's why the scholars argue so much. We don't know which Aristotle actually meant and whether he meant it mainly intellectually, that you have a sort of clear out of silly ideas and you get good ideas, whether he meant it more therapeutically for sort of disturbed emotions. We don't know. What we do know was that he was saying to his brilliant teacher, excuse me, tragedy is incredibly useful.
And what is it, what happened between Athens and a performed art form that meant that tragedy became so central to the way the city operated? Where did it come from?
Well, all the tragedies we've got about 30, every single one of them is written under this very short-lived 1.5 century thing called the Athenian democracy. And it's basically funded by the state. The choruses and all the really expensive bits like costumes are paid for a tax on the super rich. So this would be like getting, in America, like the Walmart family, to fund the entertainment for the people. But it still get cut past the democratic magistrate as useful for the people. Incredibly clever. And then all the citizens, so the theatre probably sits between 7 and 17,000. It's the male citizens and their allies. They go along for moral education together, and they watch these stories, and they actually talk about it quite a lot before Aristotle. As the tragedians are our teachers, we actually learn from them how to make moral judgments in life.
Fiona, I'd like to turn to you. It's from the introduction to Anne Carson's translation to 4 plays of Euripides, which are come under the title of Grief Lessons. And I'm particularly referring to Anne Carson because she, of course, translated the Bacchae for the production that ended here a few weeks ago. She starts the introduction to that text by saying, "Why does tragedy exist? Because you are full of rage. Why are you full of rage? Because you are full of grief." And then she goes on to say, grief and rage, you need to contain that, to put a frame around it, where it can play itself out without you or your kin having to die. Is that something that you, as a performer of Greek tragedy, is that something that you can relate to, I suppose?
I don't think we were putting on the play as any kind of a social service or, a therapeutic service, but I do think that having had the experience of playing the plays, the effect on the audience of the plays is still surprising. Edith would probably tell us more about this, but when I played something in Epidavros, not a tragedy as it happens, they say that people there swooned, at the deaths of the people on stage because they were more innocent people than we are. We've seen everything now, so we seem immune. But there's something particularly about the play Medea, maybe an element of this in Electra too, but the really frightening thing about Medea, I think, is that it's less of a tragedy in the sense of any purgation or any clearing or any air at the other end of it. It's a catastrophe. Because what happens is that as the play proceeds, at every logical phase, the audience are included with the logic and agree with the logic. And when the logic means that 2 little children have to be killed and are killed, the human mind kind of explodes. People have agreed with it and say, you're right, you have to do that. You're absolutely right, I can see why. And then it happens, and you realize that we're sort of dangling over an abyss where there isn't any purgation. And I think that was the effect the play had. People felt terribly upset by the fact that we are at our darkest, nobule of our brains, quite dark.
Mm. You said to me just now that it took you months to recover from it. Is that right?
Not months. I took a long time. I took about a year. But one of the chorus members, we met about 3 years later, who said she hadn't recovered yet. I don't know how this group are doing here. But we had played it over a long time. And over a long time, it was great fun to play. We had games at the beginning always, so we were always hysterical laughing in order to be able to spend an hour and a half in each other's company with that story every night. So, people fainted a lot and things like that. There was a lot of upset. And I think it is about this moment of people agreeing to something and then they can't believe what they've agreed to. Also, they got a fright when they saw it.
And in terms of Electra, I wanted to ask you about Electra, not least because the first panel in this festival was with Deborah Warner and Ethel van Hove and Rupert Gould. And Deborah talked about the experience of directing you in Electra. And she said that the rehearsal period was very difficult and you only really got going at the very last moment and that something was really unlocked in you. Does that ring a bell?
She shouldn't have said that.
I'm telling tales.
Actually, what happened there was I think we fell into every trap that, and I still feel, even generationally, we're almost too respectful of the Greeks. It's very interesting how you describe it and how they try to find a definition for what this tragedy was. You know, it is about human experience, and all of us participate in it all the time. There's a little Electra in all of us. There's a little Medea in all of us. There's a little, Orestes in all of us. There are little incidents in our lives where we die a little or we lose a little, and these losses are never... So I think what happened in Electra was that we kept on doing rituals every day, and we'd all seen productions where there are people bringing in, bits of grain, and of course these are meaningless. The play has nothing to do with ritual, but it seems to be written so difficultly that you think, well, I need a ritual to get into this. You could never just do this, but actually you have to do this. And if you dare to do it, really it. Try and take the pitch of the play at the beginning of the play where you think it could not go any higher, but it does begin on a sort of high C and it continues up. You think, well, that's not very good, you've got nowhere to go. Well, that's where we meet them. And that's what's very exciting about them, if you can dare to do it.
I've always wondered about that difficulty potentially of playing a role that is extreme. It starts extreme and it gets...
Extremer.
It gets extremer.
Yeah, but I think otherwise you're in some, most of the pendulum swing of our daily life, which is where soap operas are, somebody betrays somebody, somebody gets off with somebody else. That's fine. Really, they're on another level, the Greeks. They're at that point where, and they're brilliantly structured, as you all know, but with entrapments in Medea, it's profoundly important that she's not at home with her people. She has no support. And it's very interesting now, because we all live in London and not all of us are born and bred in London, how much we all live in a benign exile. But we're lucky, because certainly there are certain things, if they went really wrong, my two brothers live in France and my mother in Ireland. I have lived my life safely away from family, but it is amazing how dangerous that could be for a lot of people, or maybe how safe it is for me. It can work both ways.
Now, by sheer blunt chance, two of our panel have written dissertations or a book on Nietzsche tonight, and I didn't plan that. But Fiona wrote about Nietzsche in her dissertation. Giles wrote a book about Nietzsche, and this is very important because Nietzsche, of course, had extraordinary things to say about tragedy. Giles, can you talk a bit about the philosophy of tragedy with special,
yes,
with special attention to Nietzsche?
I haven't read your dissertation.
Well, I can assure you.
Well, Nietzsche thought tragedy died with Euripides. He was very anti-Euripides, and a sort of rationality that came in, he thought, and the death of the chorus, that's what he thought. And he thought it was reborn with Richard Wagner. And this is what he was trying to explain. And he came up with a different sort of explanation of what tragedy was than Aristotle. It wasn't anything to do with catharsis. It was something more about what you were saying about Medea, and that is that the truth of things is irredeemably horrible. The truth of existence is irredeemably horrible. Traditionally, the sort of the Christian tradition and all sorts of other traditions have said that once you find the truth will set you free. The truth is a good thing to find, and once you've found the truth, all is well. That you're saved through finding the truth. And Nietzsche thought that when you find what the truth is, you find out that it's shitter than you thought it was to start with. And so, how do you deal with this? And he posited. There were sort of two gods that he posited, which is Apollo and Dionysus. And Dionysus is the god of orgiastic chaos, wine. This is for Nietzsche, and a sort of dark nihilistic view. And that's the truth of things. And then there's this other god called Apollo, and Apollo is the god of beauty and order And what you need to do is you need to have those two things. Tragedy is the combination of Apollo and Dionysus. Dionysus tells you the world is shit and horrible, and Apollo makes it sufficiently beautiful, that message, so that you can just about bear it. So it's the triumph of art, the beautifying sort of veil that art places over the horrific nature of reality. And Nietzsche thought that was the nature of all true art, and the highest art form was tragedy, that it combines a knowledge of the truth with a way of not making us destroyed by it.
Which is actually exactly what Aristotle said when you look at another part of it. I mean, Nietzsche uses this amazing image, which I find very helpful for thinking about the tragic mask, which is that the tragic form of the poetry and the conventions, this sort of formal aesthetic corset that holds the suffering, allows you to look at the darkest things man has ever done without actually, and he uses this one, it's like Perseus and Medusa, without being turned into stone. Right? You can actually look at it. And I think that's what the tragic mask is doing. These people can actually look at Clytemnestra murdering her husband or whatever without being turned into stone. But earlier on in the Poetics, to me, the much more important passage is the one that I think Nietzsche is simply converting into his Apollonian-Dionysiac dichotomy. Aristotle says, it's the most brilliant, actually, sentence in all of ancient Greek thought, that tragedy allows you to look at things that are completely unbearable vicariously and learn from them. And he uses that word, learn through pleasure. He says there is a tragic pleasure through the vicarious learning. And he says it is like pictures of horrible animals. And he spent a lot of his time, actually, he was a zoologist, drawing sort of disgusting sea creatures and jellyfish, right? That you can look at the picture where you might flinch at looking the thing in reality. The other example he uses is corpses, that none of us can actually look at a corpse for very long without throwing up. We can look at a beautiful painting of a corpse and learn about corpseness. Now that, to me, is exactly what you've just said. It's that we can look at the darness of the Dionysiac through the aesthetic, harp-strumming Apollonian model. I don't get the difference.
But this perhaps speaks to why tragedy has been such a successful containing structure for experience down the centuries. And I mean, we can talk perhaps a bit. I mean, Fiona, Shakespeare obviously writes some tragedies. I mean, but what I must say, what I've never really, not being a Shakespearean scholar by any stretch of the imagination, is how this memory of tragedy transmits itself to Shakespeare, and what he, as it were, ends up doing with this. Actually, at that point, rather dimly remembered. It's not like he was reading Euripides or Sophocles or Aeschylus at that point, was it? Those texts were not unavailable to him.
Who?
Is that right? Shakespeare.
Oh,
did he get?
No, I'm sorry. No, that's old hat.
Is it?
The
No,
Shakespeare
I
Little
just
Latin. No, he read absolutely avidly Latin cribs in easy
the
church
crib,
Latin.
That's what I assumed.
Humanist Latin.
He'd
So
read versions of them
in easy church Latin.
Yeah.
And in particular, I mean, you can sort of, the Orostar is definitely in Hamlet, but I mean, this is now a new academic orthodoxy. It's not just me. I promise you that, for example, the moment when, even by the 17th century, people had noticed that when Lear brings on Cordelia in his arms at the end of the play, this is exactly what Haemon does with the body of his son, his beloved youngest son, Haemon, in the Antigone. Right, people were already, and we know there was a very good humanist Latin version by an Englishman of the Antigone floating around by 1585.
So it's no coincidence that Hamlet is a little bit Orestes-like.
No, he's not a little bit Orestes-like. He's extremely Orestes-like.
So,
not at all. And this is I'm very anxious to get this out to people because everybody has been taught at school that Shakespeare didn't know the Greeks, and it's just not true.
I'm sure he had, but even if he hadn't, he would have absorbed it. I think there's something about the Greeks. There's no spoiler in my referring to. Some of you will be going to see the show tonight, but what's very good.
Should I tell them the plot?
No, don't know the plot, but they know they see some. But I just want to refer to one domestic aspect when you talk about tragedy, is that there are huge battles between the husband and wife, and they're beautifully acted in this by wonderful Kate Fleetwood, and her colleagues. But the battles, even in the Euripides, are terribly funny. And they shouldn't be funny, and I don't know if they were always funny, they may not have been, but they seem very funny because there's a strange sort of sadism in us that we kind of enjoy watching other people eating the face off each other,
Absolutely.
again vicariously, but that's not the tragedy. That's just, now, Shakespeare doesn't quite seem to do that, except, oh, mother, you have my father much offended. No, come, you have my son much offended. That's a little bit like that. That actually there's a kind of foil play of aggression between people that we enjoy watching. But that's not the tragedy. It's just the format. But without the format of domestic recognition, I don't think we have tragedy. You have to identify, I suppose.
If we're talking about tragedy as a containing structure for experience that has transmitted itself away from, as it were, the Greek stage into other art forms, into other ways of describing experience, then we need look no further than the photographs of the little Syrian boy held in the Turkish policeman's arms that were published this summer that completely transformed the migrant crisis into a humanitarian refugee crisis and completely flipped public perception of what was happening in Syria just through one image. And actually that image is it's a Styanax. So a Styanax in the Trojan Women, the little child of Andromache and Hector, is flung from the... it's an appallingly sad play. I'm sure a lot of you know it. But anyway, the child is flung from the battlements of Troy and then kind of collected up, as it were, and presented, held, and shown to the audience, and then ultimately...
On his father's shield.
By Talthybius.
And Hecuba has to compose the corpse of this toddler on stage, her only grandchild. I mean, it's actually, since I had children, I can't watch it.
Yeah.
Even a bad production, I cannot watch it. I just can't.
What were you saying about the Turk? What were you going to say about the Turkish
Well,
thing?
it's also, I was going to say, it's a pietà as well, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what you think about that image, Giles, and how you reacted to this. It was very funny being in the media because we were so complicit with the way that image changed public perception. At the same time,
You see, I think I changed for a bit and then changed back again, so it hasn't changed for very long. I think one of the things where tragedy is quite difficult for people today, in terms of how they are, in terms of sort of, public culture or whatever, is that people are resolutely looking for solutions or answers or some form of upspeak at the end of something. There's always, so it's much more difficult to stay with, so every time I go to a bloody meeting about, I go to lots of church meetings about all sorts of things, and I went to one about refugees last night, and there's always a little group about what can we do and how do we do it and how do we... Now I understand how do we address the problem and so forth, and with the sort of, this is how we're going to sort it out. And nobody actually goes, sort of, I don't know how we can, and I'm not sure we can, and it's going to get worse, and actually things are irredeemably shit. And we just need to sit with things being irredeemably shit for a much longer time, rather than making us feel better about going, okay, this is how we're going to fix it. And because we find it so difficult to sit with the darkness of things being irredeemably shit, we are constantly wanting that sort of like, okay, so now what we're going to do? Or we say things like, oh, we could just do a little thing, or we could just do something, and it's all a sort of, so much of it is a way that we just try and banish the darkness, because the darkness is too terrible. So we sort of give ourselves strategies of dealing with it. We run around, hand out leaflets and all this sort of stuff. Whatever it is we do, a lot of it which is very important, but actually, and it
do
is.
you think
it is
tragedy
very
is
important.
part of that?
Tragedy is sitting with the horror, without having to finish with upspeak. And I think that's something about facing the human condition. And that's something that we find really difficult to do, because we're always trying to bloody solve it.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. I think what the image of the baby, that's pathos, isn't it? it is pathetic, and but the tragedy is the fact that if you go back and back through Europe and what's going on in Syria, that if you really look at it, we're all involved in it. That's the tragedy, is that our responsibility lies, and we can't look at that yet, or we'll have to. History will look at it, I'm sure. But when you talk about Shakespeare, there's certainly air at the end of King Lear, and there's air at the end of Macbeth, even at the death of Macbeth. There's air of a new generation, which is often what happens. But in Greek tragedy, at the end of Electra, there's just Electra going round and round and round, having lost her entire youth and her hopes of any marriage, life, hope, not in Euripides, but in the Sophocles, of any future. And she just had the bad luck of having a horrible mother who she got fixated on needing to have killed. And it ruined her life, even though she succeeded in getting the mother killed. So even when you win, you lose. And I think that's a lot of people's experience of life, even in London, Exactly. You pay your mortgage and then you die.
Maybe the Bee Gees is truthful then, because the lyric of tragedy includes, when the feeling's gone and you can't go on, it's tragedy. When the morning cries and you don't know why, it's hard to bear. With no one to love you, you're going nowhere. Tragedy. When you lose control and you've got no soul, it's tragedy. When the morning cries and you don't know why, it's hard to bear. With no one beside you, you're going nowhere. When the feeling's gone and you can't go on. It is the last scene in Oedipus, actually.
Well, it is and it isn't. Because my definition of tragedy is that it is a representation of suffering. It is about suffering. That's the one thing they all are. People suffer. They may be bereaved. They may not have been able to get out of their fixation on their mother or their father. They may, like Philoctetes, be simply in physical agony throughout the entire time. They may be feeling guilty. They may be feeling bereaved. They may have lost their city. They may be insane. It doesn't matter. They are all about suffering, right? The trouble is that is a necessary but not sufficient definition, because there are other representations of suffering, like snuff, porn. That is a representation of suffering, and it is not tragedy. Yeah, bullfighting. You actually go and watch suffering. It's not tragedy. Tragedy, that is proper tragedy that works, is a representation of suffering that makes you inquire into its causes. And all a Greek tragedy may not have any solutions, but it jolly well makes you think about the causes. And there are usually three different parties involved. One is human error. Yeah? So Creon in Antigone is just the worst ruler that the world has ever seen, who makes the most crass decisions all the time and absolutely wrecks his city. No gods involved at all. Yeah? The other is the gods, fate, we can't control it. And that is the shit bit. That is the bit out there that there is nothing that can stop, my friend Kate dying of cancer at 37 with a small baby. That was an awful card that she got, but we had to try and find out why. And the other is you get sort of more abstract metaphysical causes even than gods. You get a sort of sense that there's an all-seeing, all-knowing force beyond just the Olympian gods or something, and that we cannot ever understand it. So bafflement, right? We're actually given bafflement, that we can't get it. And all Greek tragedies basically end up with one of those.
And so how does that...
But they all ask why.
Given that we're not writing Greek tragedies in that particular form now, where has this tradition, come out into, aside from the way we frame the news, which I do think is a form of tragedy? I mean, it's crass and it's...
it looks for causes if it's good news. I mean, good, well done news. It looks for causes. It does.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. But I think, it's not just... There's a way of framing a story that turns it into something that is recognisably, generically...
But it doesn't. But related. A lot of the way in which there is a difference, isn't there, in terms of what you say about the suffering and the suffering that prompts you to inquire into its causes, into its roots.
It has an intellectual aspect.
So there is all sorts of stuff in the media that just presents you with the suffering without presenting you with an invitation to inquire into its roots.
Well, that's good and bad journalism.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's exactly right. But there's more bad journalism, I think, than there is good on this. But I also think that we are complicit. I still go back to that. I think that we also, and I think perhaps more, I suspect more than we've done before, find sitting alongside it really quite difficult. And I think, and one of the ways in which I might evidence that is that we're a culture that finds it more difficult, in my experience, to sit alongside death comfortably and the meaninglessness of death. So, if I've done hundreds of funerals in my life, and one of the things that you notice, younger people find funerals, and this is changing in the 20 years that I've been a priest, younger people find funerals more difficult to cope with, sort of offensive, almost weird, something not just like sad, but weird. There's something that isn't right about what's going on here. They won't engage with death. They won't see dead bodies. I mean, if you ask people in an age bracket how many people have seen dead bodies, generally speaking, young people haven't seen dead bodies. Older people, I mean, in the flesh, older people generally have seen dead bodies. We're becoming much more
deracinated from experience.
Yes, and I think that particularly the sitting there with a dead person, looking at it, staring death in the face, I think that's something that we are alienated from.
Irish are much better at it.
I think that's true.
But they are, but they're, yes, but the Greeks are very good at this. When you say what's happened to it, I wonder, I mean, that's partially why there's a Greek season on now. I think people are getting interested in grief again. I mean, there was a thing that I'd read around the time we did Medea, which is that because when Princess Diana died, the whole country went into mourning, having not been in mourning probably since the end of the First World War, when people had felt that they had grieved so much that they took off armbands. So there's an incredibly, it's incredibly speedy how people get through death in this country, and it does need a
but
ritual.
they don't get through.
Oh, you don't.
They are processed through it in a way that is not in any way helpful.
By the time we get to the funeral, people have got over their grief. People are buried
Oh, no.
weeks after their... So it's a very strange neurosis that has happened in this century. Also, Hollywood is obsessed with comedy, which has been to make people feel good, so they come back, buy popcorn and buy another. And actually, comedy isn't very good for you, I think, in that way. You feel great going into the car in the car park after the movie, then you feel a bit shit again, because... I don't know whether it was that funny, really. So we do need tragedy. I think it's very... I mean, maybe you're heading towards EastEnders and saying, well, it's now going into soap operas. It may be, but actually the real clarifying potential of it, it is marvellous that there's a new generation interested in it again.
I'm actually sceptical about it having any real purchase in soap opera, although I think the storylines and, as it were, memes of soap opera clearly draw on certain archetypes that we see in folk tale and tragedy and ancient storytelling. That the two brothers. I mean, this is present. This was obviously a famous storyline in EastEnders and The Archers. The two brothers who are both in love with the same woman. These very sort of fundamental stories. But I'm not sure whether I find catharsis through The Archers very often. Although it may
try, though you will.
May happen from time to time. But I was thinking more of the novel, actually, or as an inheritor of the tragic tradition. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think you absolutely should think of narratives. The tragic, certainly the great 19th century novelist George Eliot and...
in death they were not parted. I just cry now.
Hardy, Thomas Hardy. These people were immersed in Greek tragedy and were consciously using the sort of apparatus of a sort of more metaphysical sort of set of malign forces. I mean, Tess of the D'Urbervilles is absolutely clear. He actually says the Olympians are lined up against her when she goes to Stonehenge and that she has no chance and so on. That there is no doubt in my mind at all that the tragic in the 19th century, which actually didn't like tragedy at all, it liked burlesque theatre and Gilbert and Sullivan, the tragic transferred into prose fiction. I mean, I have no doubts about that at all. What I do think that soap opera shares, though, with Greek tragedy is its original function in society. It may not do it as well, but I know that my students and my cleaning lady go home, talk through ethics over what X should do or not do, and whether so-and-so's being a bastard in the soap opera, who caused that family to break up, and is it the woman's fault, or is it because he can't keep it in his pants or whatever. Done properly, it stimulates the creation of ethical consensus and norms and agreement. In a communal way, you can get
But that's the crucial thing, isn't it?
That's
A lot of people have to be able to have that conversation in a sense. It has to be. I mean, nearly every
useful.
adult man in Athens was watching this stuff, right?
And I watch.
So in that sense, EastEnders is a.
I do watch EastEnders. It's the one I do watch because it's a long custom with my children. So it gives me something I can talk about to them. And we talk about ethics and abortion and death and all these things through precisely these vicarious versions which aren't going to hurt them.
Giles,
But I just worry about that. I don't want to pick a fight because I'm sure you're right, but what I worry about is that it sounds like what you've got is a sort of drama that's illustrative of its value is that it provokes certain sorts of moral conversations, which are, well, and then it's rather good that we have those conversations and we're better people for having those conversations. Yeah. My problem with that is that's not dark enough for me. Right. So that is all too. This has some great, wider, deeper, wonderful purpose. And I think that there is a role for us facing stuff which is genuinely dark without us trying to give it some wider purpose.
Okay.
Quickly trying to have some wider purpose.
Sorry, I'm going to Bertrand Russell you now. I'm just going to have to do it. I have tried not to. But, this guy is an ordained Anglican minister. Right? How many of us have given up on Christianity because of the problem of suffering, and that it is just shit, and there is no good design, and there are good people, there is no providence, good people die horrible deaths, bad people live happily ever after. If you were just a jolly good, upfront agnostic like me, fine. But how can you stand in that pulpit and say there is no meaning? People want their money back.
It's not a joke.
I'm not saying it's a joke. It makes me cross. My father is an Anglican minister, and he could never get this. And he said, suffering makes you better.
No, I don't
believe... It does not. It makes you worse.
Well, let me answer. I don't think it makes you better. I absolutely don't think it makes you better. And I think Christianity doesn't end with it. I think it begins with the experience of suffering. And I don't think it gives you a cheap answer, which is what you're castigating me for not having, because I don't. And I think to that extent, Christianity is much more like tragedy. And I think Christianity has been missold as a cheap answer to suffering. I don't think Christianity is a good answer to suffering. I don't have a good answer to suffering, as I don't think anybody else has a good answer to young women having cancer with children or the other sorts of suffering that I would sit alongside a lot. So I slightly disagree with you about this being the reason why people give up on Christianity. I think there's other reasons people give up on Christianity. And I don't think the intellectual problem of suffering, I think the existential problem of suffering often drives people towards those who have an experience of brokenness. And often that is the church. So there's different parts of the church.
So there's existential suffering and
no, so I think those people who... I think certainly when I'm at my most broken... that's when I find the church most convincing. And that's actually what a number of people find. So it happens strangely the other way to what you say. It's often the case that people who have huge tragedies in their life seek out a place where that level of suffering can be attended to in some way. And so the church does attend to it. It gives it space, it's one of those places where it can be spoken of and apprehended. So, and intellectually, I think people don't move away from the church because of the problem of suffering. I mean, I think it's an important problem. We could talk about it intellectually, but I don't think it's true existentially. I think it's the other way around.
Can I say
yes,
about it?
please.
Well, one reason why I might have left the church is because it had a question about whether women could be redeemed. The great thing about Greek tragedy is that women tend to be at the centre of it, if only because their suffering is that they are a lower form of human life than the male. But it is fantastic that at the root of our civilization was the most degraded human was the female human. And that somehow has in it an exquisite totality about it. The church has sinned a lot along the way in relation to that gender. And that would be a reason. I mean, that doesn't deal with it. But I do agree with you that it's a place of suffering and a place for suffering to go. But unlike Shakespeare, where there is again a kind of an exquisite poetry to the suffering, even Cleopatra, we are dying, Egypt dying. You think, oh, this is just gorgeous. There's nothing gorgeous about the Greek suffering person. And there's nothing sort of soothing where a church, I suppose, steps in and tries to soothe. There is nothing soothing.
And Hector actually says that in The Trojan Women, the play that we were talking about earlier, with which she actually says that I simply cannot accept anymore that there are any gods whatsoever, given what my city's gone through.
So Edith with the Church of Greek Tragedy.
Yeah.
And we'll leave Giles to the Church of England. But I would... I'd very much like to open it up to all of you now at this point for the last moments of this session. Forgive me, I've got to summarise the question back for the purpose of recording. So, do you think the vast differences between Greek religion and modern religion and all the apparatus associated with that alienate modern audiences? Will that do?
Nietzsche, of course, thought Christianity was popular Platonism, and that's part of why he hated it. And I sort of think, I sort of agree with him, actually. So part of my... I dislike quite intensely the sort of metaphysical stuff that gets associated, has traditionally been associated with Christianity. And so I disagree with your question in a way. I think that actually it's remarkably similar. I think quite a lot of contemporary religion is remarkably similar to that. And I wish it wasn't.
I would just answer simply yes. If you're adapting one of these texts for the stage, you have just got to do something with all these confusing names and all the rest of it. And different practitioners do it completely differently. Frank McGuinness, who's a very successful adapter of Greek tragedy for the stage, tends to just talk about God with a small g, or the gods, when instead of the vast array of the, Artemis, Apollo, blah, 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 blah. Everyone has to make their own decision. But yes, I do think for getting a modern audience arrested, it requires a 20-week lecture course on the Greek pantheon.
What do you think, Fiona?
Well, I was at something about T.S. Eliot last night, who says something in the Four Quartets about life, in our end is our beginning, partially because it's full of infinite moments, life. So actually time doesn't really exist because it's full of infinite moments. And at the end of Medea, when Deborah and I did it, we didn't have a carriage come down and take Medea away, having killed her children. We left her there, and her husband came in, and they started sort of playing with each other again, and you felt that they might go to bed together that night and have babies again, that the whole thing might happen again. And that's probably a post-Beckett notion. So in a way, religion, in the sense of being a solution to things, has ceased to be a theatrical solution to things. And I won't spoil tonight's play, but what they do is
So the question is... it was pointed out in a previous panel that plays were written by men to be looked at for men, and maybe there's a certain kind of Freudian aspect to this. How would you respond to that?
I don't mind. I mean, I don't mind because I wasn't
off the church for that.
I didn't slag off the church. But if you want me to start slagging off the church, I really will. I had plenty of the church up to here. So I just feel that's probably true, that in a funny way, maybe looking at women who were suffering on the stage, of course, all masked and played by men, it's 2,000 years ago. So I'm sure that was the way in which they could look at suffering, and they just made the female personage a personage because it suited them for that moment. But I I don't feel it's quite relevant to how we do them now. The point is we're freed to do them in any way we want now.
I mean, this is the great irony, isn't it, that these great playwrights, wrote great parts for women that they didn't write for women.
Yes,
They're all written for men.
Yes, don't worry. Yes. Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Well,
Edith?
firstly, I would actually say, and I know I did this earlier with Shakespeare, but actually there is a very great deal of evidence that although the actual premieres, which were at the Athenian city Dionysia in the 5th century of the plays we've got, there were very few women because all the men wanted to go and the women were less important. In fact, women went all the time to all the many, many revivals in the village shows, and they knew tragedy just as well, and there is loads and loads of evidence of that.
I read that because I read it in your books.
I knew that.
And Plato actually says that the women and the young go crazy for tragedy because they feel it's about them. So which is exactly what is true. I do think that, I don't know if I want the word Freud particularly, I don't find him any more helpful than Nietzsche. These sort of late 19th century, highly self-obsessed sort of German-speaking people, playing around with Greek tragic texts. But I do think that there's something about men who were getting together in a society which was pretty proscriptive about the expression of emotion, finding women very useful, female figures as, yes, those vicarious surrogates through which to do grief. I mean, most of the men sitting in the audience have lost sons in battle, practically all of them. And one of the things Plato says in the Republic is tragedy is bad for you because it makes you weep for the son you lost in battle. But in fact, I think all that weeping for the son you lost in battle, while Clytemnestra weeps for Iphigenia, is incredibly healthy.
That's another thing worth saying is that all these, particularly the plays of Euripides, were written during a time of war and a
Terrible
nation.
war.
That nation, every citizen of which was completely
Every family
up to their neck in it.
Every family lost at least
which may be
man.
one answer to why there are so many Greek productions now, is that we are dealing with, in some way, as a society, war.
We're dealing with the unthinkable. The fact that there's beheadings now on the news. We never heard the word beheading except in a religious context. But the fact that it's now part of... we're back there again.
So the question is to summarise it, is there any relationship between the way ancient audiences reacted to tragedy, to our own time, audiences in our own time reacting to much more extreme forms of art, such as psychological horror films?
I mean, using what was said earlier, the thing about psychological horror films, I was made to sit with my daughter through Saw 4 the other day, which was not an experience I want to repeat. Not because it was so horrible, but because it was so ungenerative of anything interesting morally.
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
Which is what
I've been saying. Yeah.
Though there are modern sort of dark things that are. I mean, I think Dexter's pretty generative of interesting moral sort of questions. So that there are some pretty, dark things that do that. But I think, so my experience is limited to Saw 4.
What is Saw 4?
What?
What is it?
Don't even want to. They're sort of stuck in a dark room like this, and it's like it starts actually.
How old is your daughter?
20.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Edith's really worried. Edith's really worried about Giles' morals. I think we've
But there's a connection between Saw 4 or whichever ones you're talking about. Is when we did Medea, one of the things that people really loved was that the children ran at one point, and I just ran after them. No child was hurt during the production of anything. But one of the children ran, and suddenly I caught it. And when I caught that child, people used to go, "Amma!"
Yeah.
And so even in the middle of this, it's the pretension of believing that because it's a Greek tragedy, it is of its nature sad or upsetting is not true. You do have to play with very low feelings, and Deborah always called it her B-movie moment. But it was one of the most successful moments of the whole show.
Yeah.
People going, "Ah!" and all that's happened is a child's been grabbed because they can see the rest.
Oh yes, well, theatre
So
has
that
to
is
play some
that's a
low
B-movie.
tricks sometimes,
Yeah, low
doesn't
tricks.
it?
So
Yeah.
low tricks have to meet high tricks.
Well, maybe so, but I've done quite a lot of research on, and I'm in fact going to write a book about the forensic, actually the psychological evidence about women who kill their children. I wanted to do this to find out what the profile is, and in fact, it's unbelievably terrifyingly accurate, the Medea, in that parents of both sexes, and as I say, I think men go along and watch this in classical Athens, right, whose partner, the parent of their children, leave them for sex with someone else in any way, when that's involved. For about 2 weeks, all children are in incredible danger if they're left alone with the abandoned parent. All children, even just a beating, not necessarily being killed, they are in incredible, they become a hate object, half of them is the hated parent, all the rest of it. And it's especially boys with women, men do it arbitrarily. The most decent person who would never hit anybody hits their children in these circumstances. And the particular thing Euripides got so right is the isolation of Medea from her natal family. The absence of a mother or a sister or an aunt.
To say, calm down,
yes,
or don't worry. Or...
That is what he gets. Yes, she's got this rather ineffectual nurse, actually. But so the classic profile is an immigrant. It really is. They're usually better educated than most female murderers. Most female murderers kill their men, right? And they're not so well educated. They're often very well educated. Medea is very clever. They've always got form. They have always had a violent incident before. You know, she killed a brother. They're incredibly isolated with no adult. I mean, the correspondences are chilling. And,
which is why Dr. Foster on the BBC telly works so well, isn't it?
No, absolutely. And so either Euripides just, you know, this really did go on in antiquity when we just haven't got the real life
Isn't
cases.
there also an element of obliteration? Just maybe that would bump into your world, Giles, but there was this a terrible incident recently I read. I keep on meeting Medeas in the newspaper, and they're often men. A man killed his family because the wife wanted to go back to India and take the children, and he obviously just couldn't stand that his life would come to an end if she did that. He couldn't see beyond it, and the only way to manage it was to go into oblivion with them. And something about oblivion is being explored in the plays too, I think. The notion that there is just blackness beyond at a certain point.
Absolutely.
And that's very sad. I think that's so sad because it's beyond the law and morality. It's a human condition element too, I think. Very sad.
One of the interesting things, I'll just say something about that experience of blackness is like, the only time, I mean, I sometimes have bouts of depression, which I talk about quite a lot. It's my experience of the real darkness. One of the really interesting things about when you have that is I find people are very, very, they want very quickly to medicalise it. They want, as it were, to see that as a problem there. Now, for some people, depression is something that for which pills are appropriate and so forth. But people find just the sitting in that space, in that darkness, is something that it has to be it has to be a medical problem, it has to be some sort of, it has to be treatable, or it has to be, and the facing of it, the idea that you can do that in the theatre. This may be one of those spaces which is why it's a sort of, it's a sacred thing to do in a way, is to be sitting there and facing that absolute bleakness without any mediation. And that's what I find so absolutely crucially and wonderfully important about people seeing a play like that. To sit with it and then perhaps you're not afraid of it quite so much. You perhaps
or you notice
you
it,
make your peace, or you notice,
and you might be able to stop it.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
You become more attuned to it, Absolutely right.
I think they're negative lessons. I mean, I think they're like this is how things are done really badly, from which you can actually infer positive inferences. Like, you don't leave a crazy, brilliant, proud woman like Medea alone while you're shagging somebody.
And expect nothing to happen.
Exactly. Good lesson.
Well, on that good lesson,
I'll write that one down, actually.
Don't ever do that, dear audience. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience tonight. If you're going to see the show tonight, enjoy it. It only gets more grim. It's a completely fantastic show if you are seeing it. And please join me in thanking our lovely panel, Fiona, Edith and Giles. Thank you very much.